She wasn't supposed to be on my route. 150. If the dispatcher hadn't called in sick that Tuesday morning, if I hadn't taken the Lakeshore extension as a favor to Brendan, who had a dentist appointment in Etobicoke, if any one of about 15 small things had gone differently that February, I never would have been the guy who pulled that coach up to the corner of Bay and Front at 7:14 in the morning and opened those doors. But I did, and she got on. And 50. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit I have. My daughter Fern tells me I always start stories in the middle and then have to back up, and she's not wrong. She's 9 and she's already figured out most of my patterns. Kids are like that. They watch you more carefully than you think they do. My name is Tom Beckett. I drive a transit coach for the TTC. I have driven that same basic category of vehicle, bus, coach, articulated, for 11 years, ever since I got out of the trades after my back said it was done with roofing in a way that made the point very clearly one morning on a job site in Scarborough. I am 38 years old. I live in a rented semi-detached on Danforth near Greenwood with Fern, and a border collie named Pocket, who is objectively smarter than most people I have met in the transit industry. I want to be honest about what my life looked like at that point because I think it matters. It wasn't a hard life. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was barely surviving because that would be an exaggeration and I don't like exaggerations. But it was a life that had gotten very narrow. Fern's mother, her name was Carla, left when Fern was 14 months old. Not dramatically. Not in the way you see in movies. She just came to me one evening and told me she had made a mistake and that she was not built for this. Meaning the baby, meaning the mortgage, meaning I understood later, me, and she left, and I stayed. Because staying was the only thing that made sense when there was a 14-month-old who needed someone to stay. That was 8 years before the February I'm talking about. In those 8 years, I had become, I don't know how to put this except plainly, I had become the job and the kid. There wasn't much else. I had friends in the way that shift workers have friends, which is to say I had people I liked a lot and saw rarely. I had a brother in Hamilton I called on Sundays. I had a routine that worked, and I had learned not to want things that would disrupt the routine, because the routine was holding everything together and I knew it. Fern was the brightest part of every day. I want to make sure that's clear. She was funny and she was serious in the way some kids are. Serious about the things that mattered to her, which were currently birds, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the question of whether dogs have opinions or just preferences. She'd been asking me that last one for 3 weeks. I still didn't have a good answer. So that was me, Tom Beckett, bus driver, dad, Danforth semi, border collie, narrow life held together with routine and love. That Tuesday in February, I pulled up to the Bay and Front stop at 7:14, and a woman got on who looked like she had not slept in approximately 4 days. She was maybe 40, maybe a bit younger, I'm bad at ages, dark coat, good quality, the kind of coat that costs money in a quiet way without advertising it, hair that was supposed to be neat and wasn't quite making it. And she had these eyes, I noticed because she was looking directly at me when she stepped on, which almost nobody does. Most people are looking at their phones before they've even cleared the door. She had these eyes that were doing that thing, where a person is holding a very large amount of something in, and it's taking real effort. She tapped her Presto card. It beeped wrong, declined. She looked at it like it had personally betrayed her, and I had seen that exact expression, the expression of a person who has been up since 3 a.m. dealing with something, and has now encountered one more thing. I had seen it enough times to know what it meant. "It's fine," I said. "Go ahead and sit down." She looked at me. "I have money. I can." "I know you do," I said. "The machine has an attitude. Go sit down." She sat down, not near the front. She went about 4 rows back, and she sat by the window and she looked out at the lake, which was frozen solid and gray and honestly beautiful in the way that Lake Ontario is beautiful in February when the light comes over it, flat and cold. I didn't think about her again for most of the route. I had stops to make. I had the job. She was the last one off, near Dufferin. She came up to the front and she had cash in her hand, a 5 exact fare, which told me she'd looked it up, and she held it out to me. "You didn't have to do that," I said. She said, "Thank you," and she got off. I found out later, much later, that morning had been the day she had fired her board of directors, all 12 of them. that she had walked into a room of people who had been trying to push her out of her own company for 6 months, and she had instead pushed them out, and that she had then walked out of the building alone at 7 in the morning, because her driver hadn't been called and she couldn't remember how to hail a cab, and she had spotted the bus and just gotten on. That was Margot Deschênes. I did not know any of this at the time. I saw her again 3 weeks later. I was at the Loblaws on Danforth on a Saturday afternoon with Fern, who was supposed to be helping me pick out something for dinner, but had instead become completely transfixed by a display of ceramic bird figurines near the entrance, and was delivering a quiet monologue about inaccuracies in the painted plumage of a ceramic chickadee. "The beak proportion is wrong," she was telling the chickadee specifically. "You'd know that if you'd ever seen one." "Fern," I said, "pasta or rice?" "Both are fine," she said, still looking at the chickadee. "Dad, look at this beak." I looked at the beak. I agreed the beak was wrong. We moved on to produce, and I was standing there with a bag of carrots when someone beside me said, "You're the bus driver." I turned around. It was the woman from February. She looked different, better rested, or maybe just less acutely distressed. She was in a different coat, weekend coat, casual, and she looked, I don't know, more like a person who had an ordinary weekend ahead of them. She was looking at me with a specific expression, the expression of someone who has placed a face but not the context. "Bay in front," I said, "February." "You let me on for free," she said. The machine had an attitude. She smiled at that. It was a real smile, the kind that changes someone's whole face. "I'm Margot," she said. "Tom." Fern had appeared beside me with a zucchini she'd picked up for no reason I could identify. "Who's that?" she said, not to me, but to Margot directly. "I'm Margot," Margot said, looking down at her. "Who are you?" "Fern," Fern said. She held up the zucchini. "Did you know this is technically a fruit?" "I did know that," Margot said. Fern's expression shifted into something like respect. Most people don't. We stood there in the produce section for a few minutes. I don't remember exactly what we talked about. Small things, the kind of things you talk about in grocery stores on Saturday afternoons. But I remember that Margot talked to Fern the way some adults do and most don't, which is directly and seriously, as though what Fern was saying mattered, which of course it did. And I remember thinking that was notable. We went our separate ways. I bought pasta and forgot the carrots. The third time I saw Margot Deschênes, I knew who she was. It was Brendan, my dispatcher, who told me. Brendan follows business news the way some people follow sports, and when I mentioned the woman I'd run into at Loblaws, I described her. I mentioned the name. He looked at me the way people look at you when you have said something remarkable without knowing it. "Margot Deschênes," he said. 50, yeah. Margot Deschênes is the founder of Crestline Pacific. You know Crestline Pacific? I did not know Crestline Pacific. They do infrastructure financing, bridges, transit corridors, power grid. They are worth, he paused meaningfully, a lot. "Okay," I said. "She's been on the front page of the Globe 3 times this year." "I don't read the Globe." "Tom." "What?" He just looked at me. I shrugged and went to check my route sheet. Thought about it, though, on the drive home that evening. I tried to figure out if it changed anything. A woman I had led on the bus for free and then talked to in a grocery store turned out to be a billionaire. I tested the information from different angles. It didn't seem to change anything. She had still looked exhausted. The beak on the chickadee had still been wrong. Fern had still charmed her with a zucchini fact. I decided it didn't change anything. The fourth time, she came to me. I was at the stop at Broadview and Danforth. End of my afternoon route, 15-minute break, coffee from the Tim Hortons on the corner, and she walked up and sat down on the bench beside me. In February, this would have been remarkable. It was now late April, and people sat on benches, so it was slightly less remarkable. But she had clearly come there on purpose. "Looked up your route," she said. "Okay," I said. "I wanted to ask you something, and I didn't have another way to reach you." I waited. "I have a daughter," she said, "Camille. She's 8. I hadn't known this. I said so. She had a hard year. Margot looked out at Broadview, at the streetcars, at the particular organized chaos of that intersection. Her father and I separated 2 years ago. She's been very quiet. Her teachers say she's engaged in class, but at home she barely talks to me. I don't mean she's rude. She's not rude. She looks at me sometimes like she's waiting for something and I don't know what it is." She stopped. I didn't fill the silence. I've learned, driving, that silence is often not a problem to be solved. "When we ran into you at the grocery store," Margot said, "she talked about you for 2 days. About the beak. About you agreeing with her about the beak. She said," she paused and something in her voice changed, became more careful. "She said you were the first adult who looked at her like she was worth listening to." I sat with that for a second. "She only met me for 4 minutes," I said. Margot said, "That's the part that got me. Here is what I want to say about that moment, and I want to say it honestly, as someone who has thought about it a lot. I was not trying to be anything to Camille-Shane. I did not do anything deliberate or strategic in that grocery store. I just looked at her and heard what she was saying, because when a kid is telling you something they think is important, the right thing to do is to confirm that it is. That's it. That's the whole thing. But I have also learned in 8 years of being Fern's only parent that the thing kids are most hungry for is not entertainment or activities or even love in the abstract. It is the specific sensation of being truly noticed, seen, not managed, not redirected, not accommodated, actually seen. And some kids go a long time without it, and they know the difference the second it happens. Camille knew, and she told her mother. Margot asked if Fern and Camille might be able to spend some time together. She framed it as something for the kids, which it was, but I think we both understood it was also something else, though neither of us said so. I said I'd ask Fern. Fern's response was, "Does she know about birds?" I relayed this question. Margot relayed it to Camille. Camille sent back through Margot, "She says she knows about the ones in British Columbia." Fern considered this. "That's a start," she said. They met at Riverdale Farm on a Saturday in May. I was there, Margot was there, and we spent most of the afternoon trailing 2 8- and 9-year-old girls who were deeply in conversation about things that had nothing to do with us. Camille, it turned out, had been quiet in the way that some kids are quiet. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had been saying it to the wrong people, or people who weren't quite listening. With Fern, she was not quiet at all. At one point, they were leaning on a fence looking at a pair of goats and arguing about whether goats were smarter than dogs, and Margot looked at me and said, quietly, "I haven't heard her laugh like that in about a year." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. We got coffee while the girls watched the chickens. We talked about our kids the way parents do, specifically, carefully, with the particular tenderness that comes from caring about something that small and that important. Margot told me about Camille's father, whose name was Renaud, who was in Montreal now, who Camille saw twice a month, who was not a bad man but had been a distant one. I told Margot about Carla, about how Fern didn't ask about her much anymore, about how I'd spent years dreading that phase, and then it had arrived and turned out to be quieter than I'd feared. "She's remarkable," Margot said about Fern. "She is," I said. "I can't take much credit. She mostly raised herself." "That's not true," Margot said. She said it quietly, but like she meant it. We kept meeting after that. Not formally, not in a way that was planned or labeled. The girls wanted to see each other, and so we made it possible. High Park. The waterfront. A Saturday morning in July at the farmer's market on Bloor, where Fern made Camille smell every kind of cheese, and Camille, to her enormous credit, smelled all of them. Somewhere in there something shifted. I am not able to tell you exactly when. That's the thing about shifts. They are not events. They are gradual accumulations of small moments that you only recognize as a shift when you look back. I noticed I looked forward to Saturdays in a way that I hadn't before. I noticed that Margot laughed differently than she did in the early weeks. More easily, more often, the laugh arriving before she could think about it. I noticed she had started texting me links to things she thought Fern would like. An article about a new bird species documented in northern Ontario, a video of a border collie doing something impressive, in the way that you do when you are thinking about someone's kid because you are thinking about someone. I noticed these things and I set them aside because I am a person who has learned, carefully and over time, not to want things that would disrupt the stability of the life I have built. Also, I was a transit driver. She was Margot Deschênes of Crestline Pacific. There is a version of reality in which that gap does not matter. I am not sure I lived in that version. The thing that changed it was Camille. It was a Sunday in September. The four of us had spent the afternoon at the CNE, which had technically ended, but someone had told Margot about an agricultural fair running an extra weekend, and we'd spent 2 hours looking at prize vegetables and heritage breed livestock. And Fern and Camille had together attempted to pet an alpaca with mixed results. We were walking back to the car, Margot's car, which was understated in the way her coat had been understated, nice but not announcing itself, and the girls were ahead of us, and Camille turned around and looked at me. Not at her mom, at me. And she said, "Tom, are you going to keep being around?" Just that, the directness of children. Margot's had gone very still beside me. I looked at Camille. She was looking at me with those eyes that Margot had, the same structure, holding something carefully. She was 8 years old, and she was asking me a real question, and she deserved a real answer. "I'd like to," I said, "if that's okay with you." She thought about it. Actually thought about it in the way Fern thinks about things, like the question deserved consideration. "Fern would miss our bird talks," she said finally. "She would," I said. "So you probably should keep coming around," Camille said. "It would be unfair to Fern otherwise." And then she turned around and kept walking, catching up to Fern, and I heard her say something to Fern about the alpaca, and Fern laughed. Beside me, Margot had not moved. I looked at her, and she was looking at her daughter, and her eyes were bright, and she was biting her lip in the specific way people do when something has gotten to them, and they don't want it to show too much. "She hasn't done that," Margot said quietly. "She hasn't. She doesn't let people in. It's been 2 years and she doesn't let people in." She stopped. "She just let you in." "She's looking out for Fern," I said. Looked at me. "Tom." "She's 8, she was being logical about." "Tom," Margot said again. I stopped talking. We stood there for a moment on the exhibition grounds with the lake behind us and the city ahead of us and the girls walking away into the afternoon. "I don't know how to do this," Margot said. I mean, I don't know how to want something again and not be afraid of it. I was very good at not wanting things for a while. It felt safe. I knew exactly what she meant. "Same," I said, which was inadequate, but it was true. "Camille likes you," she said. "I like Camille," I said. "I like you too," Margot said, in case that was unclear. "It was a little unclear," I said. She laughed. There was the real laugh, the one that arrived before she could think about it. "I'm a bus driver," I said, not apologizing, just stating. "I know what you are," she said. "I got on your bus in February, and I was a disaster, and you looked at me like I was just a person who needed to get somewhere. Do you know how rare that is?" She shook her head slightly. "You looked at Camille in a grocery store for 4 minutes, and she felt it for 2 days. That's..." "Tom, I spent 2 years having people look at her and not see her. You saw her in 4 minutes." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, honestly. I'm not sure there's a response to it. You either see people or you don't. I learned it from Fern, if I learned it from anywhere. When you have a kid who is always watching, always processing, you start to understand that being seen is the thing. Everything else is secondary. We walked to the car. The girls were already at it, Fern explaining something to Camille with gestures that suggested it was probably bird-related. And 50. It was slow after that. That's the honest version. It was not a sudden thing. We were both people who had built careful lives around keeping certain things from tipping over, and adding something new to a careful life requires carefulness. We saw each other with the girls. We talked on the phone in the evenings when the girls were in bed. I met Margot's assistant, a very competent woman named Brigitte, who looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Margot met my brother Glenn in Hamilton at Thanksgiving, and he texted me afterward just, "Okay, I get it." Camille and Fern had by October developed what could only be described as a shared obsession with the migratory patterns of shorebirds along the Lake Ontario corridor, which they pursued with an intensity that I found both impressive and slightly alarming. They had a shared notebook. There were colored tabs. The first time Camille called me Tom in front of her grandmother, Margot's mother, Hélène, who was from Quebec City and had opinions. Hélène looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, and then looked at me and said, in French-accented English, "You are the bus driver." "Yes," I said. "Camille speaks of you a great deal," she said. "She's a good kid," I said. Hélène considered me for what felt like a long time. "Margot's father drove a delivery truck," she said finally, before the business. She went back to her tea. I understood that I had passed some kind of evaluation. I do not want to make this into a love story in the movie sense, because that would make it a different thing than it was. It was 2 people and 2 kids and a border collie named Pocket, and a lot of Saturday mornings and phone calls and the gradual, terrifying, hopeful business of trusting someone again. It was Fern asking me, one evening in November, is Margot going to be around for a long time? And me saying I hoped so, and Fern nodding like that confirmed something she'd already decided. It was Camille, that same month, telling Margot told me later, that Tom was the kind of person who looks at you properly. Exactly that, looks at you properly. 8 years old. She nailed it in 4 words. I've been trying to explain it for paragraphs. There's a thing that happens sometimes. In the job, when you've been driving the same route long enough, you know the regulars. You know the guy who always runs for the bus and always makes it. You know the woman who gets on at Woodbine every Tuesday with library books. You know which stops are going to have a crowd and which ones are going to be empty, and you know how the light falls differently in October than it does in July. You know your route so well that you stop seeing it. And then something changes. A new building goes up, a tree comes down, a coffee shop closes and becomes something else, and suddenly you're looking at the whole route again, noticing things you'd stopped noticing. That's what it was like. I had stopped noticing, not Fern I noticed every day, constantly, but myself, my own life, the possibility that it could be more than what I had made it. I wasn't unhappy. That's important. I wasn't a man waiting to be rescued. I had a good life with a kid I loved and a job I didn't mind and a dog with strong opinions, but I had gotten used to the shape of it, the narrowness. I had made the narrowness into a virtue because it was easier than wanting things that felt out of reach. And then Margot got on my bus on a Tuesday morning in February with a declined Presto card and dark circles under her eyes, and she sat by the window and looked at the frozen lake, and I let her on because the machine had an attitude and she clearly needed to get somewhere. That's all. That's the whole start of it. I am telling you this because I think there is something in it that matters beyond my own situation. I think about Camille saying, looks at you properly. I think about the specific hunger that lives in people, kids and adults, both who have gone a long time being looked at without being seen. I think about how little it actually takes to do the thing. To just look. To let someone say what they think about a chickadee beak and confirm that yes, the beak is wrong, because it is, and they are right, and they deserve to be right out loud. I think about how I almost didn't take Brendan's route that morning, how close the whole thing came to not happening. Fern asked me once, this was recent, a few weeks ago, she asked me, Dad, do you think things happen for a reason or do they just happen? She asked me things like that sometimes, 9 years old. I thought about it the way she'd want me to, which is seriously. I think things just happen, I said, but I think what matters is what you do when they do. She considered this. So the reason is the person, she said. I looked at her. Yeah, I said. Exactly, the reason is the person. She nodded and went back to the field guide she'd been sharing with Camille, currently on extended loan from the Beaches branch of the Toronto Public Library, tabbed to a section on sandpiper migration. And I sat there in the kitchen of the Danforth semi, Pocket asleep under the table, Margot's jacket on the hook by the door, where it had been for the better part of a month now, and I thought about a Tuesday in February and a declined Presto card and a woman looking out at a frozen lake. And I thought, yeah, the reason is the person. It always is. I keep thinking about the moment Camille turned around on that path at the CNE and asked me, straight out, are you going to keep being around? 8 years old, no preamble, no softening. Just the question she needed answered. There's a kind of honesty in children that most adults have learned to talk themselves out of. Somewhere along the way, we decide it's safer not to ask the things we actually want to know. We protect ourselves from the answer by never putting the question out loud. Camille hadn't learned that yet. Or maybe she had learned something better, that the cost of not asking is higher than the cost of hearing something hard. I think about what it took for her to get to that question. A year of watching quietly, months of figuring out whether I was the kind of person who shows up or the kind who eventually doesn't. She was doing the slow, patient work of deciding whether to trust, and when she'd gathered enough evidence, she asked. That's not just bravery, That's a kind of careful intelligence, reading a situation accurately, waiting until you have enough information, and then acting on what you know. Fern does the same thing with birds. You don't assume, you observe, you verify. And I think about what it took for me to be a person Camille could eventually trust. I didn't do anything heroic. I confirmed that a chickadee beak was wrong. I led a tired woman on a bus in February without making it a thing. I listened when Fern talked about birds because she was worth listening to. Small things, ordinary things, but they compounded the way things do when you do them consistently enough over time, without expecting anything back. That's the part I want to sit with. I wasn't trying to be anything to Margot or Camille. I was just being the person I'd tried to be with Fern for 8 years. Present, paying attention, not looking past people to whatever was next. You do that long enough, it becomes the thing you carry into every room, every bus, every grocery store produce section. It stops being something you decide and starts being something you are, and people feel it, kids especially. The hardest part of all of this, the part that cost something, was letting it matter. I had spent years getting very good at not wanting too much, keeping the life small and manageable and safe. There's a real discipline in that, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't also a kind of protection. But at some point, discipline that keeps everything out stops being discipline and starts being fear wearing a practical outfit. Margot said she didn't know how to want something again without being afraid of it. I knew exactly what she meant because I had been building the same wall from the other side. The willingness to take that wall down anyway, not because you're certain it'll be fine, but because the thing on the other side is worth the uncertainty. That's the part that took everything I had. I'm a bus driver on the Danforth. I have a border collie with opinions and a daughter who knows more about shorebird migration than most ornithologists. My life is not what anyone would write a business profile about, but it is, I think, a life built on the right things. On showing up, on looking at people properly, on being willing to stay when staying is what's needed. Camille figured that out in 4 minutes in a grocery store. I'm still catching up to what she saw.